November 1805, Prince Vasili was obliged to go to 4 governments on a tour of inspection. He had secured this commission for himself so as to visit one of his ruined estates, and it was his intention, having picked up his son Anatole, who was with his regiment at one of the places on his route, to go with him on a visit to Prince Nikolai Andreyevich Bolkonsky, so as to marry this same son to the daughter of this wealthy old man. But before starting on this journey and undertaking these new duties, Prince Vasili felt called upon to bring Pierre's little affair to a crisis. The truth was, Pierre, during these latter days of his visit at Prince Vasili's, had shown himself absurd, agitated, and moping in Ellen's presence, the proper condition of a man in love, but still he had not made his decision. Tout ça est bel et bon, mais il faut que ça finisse. It must be decided, said Prince Vasili one morning with a melancholy sigh, confessing to himself that Pierre, considering under what obligations he was to him, though Christ be with him, was not behaving very nicely in this matter. Youth, fickleness. Well, God bless him, said Prince Vasili, with a feeling of satisfaction at his own benevolence. Mais il faut que ça finisse. Day after tomorrow is Leolina's birthday. I will have a little party for her, and if he does not come up to the point in seeing what his duty is, then it will be my affair. Yes, my affair. I am her father. A fortnight after Anna Pavlovna's reception, and the sleepless, agitated night that followed it, when he had made up his mind that to marry Ellen would lead to unhappiness, and that it was his duty to flee from her and to go away, Pierre, in spite of this decision, was still at Prince Vasili's, and felt with a sort of horror that each day he was becoming, in the eyes of the world, more and more attached to her, that he could not return to his former way of looking upon her, could not tear himself from her, that it was abominable, but still he must link his fate with hers. Perhaps he might have abstained, but scarcely a day passed that Prince Vasili, who formerly had so rarely given receptions, did not have company, and Pierre was obliged to be present, unless he were willing to disturb the general contentment and disappoint the expectation of all. Prince Vasili, during those rare moments when he was at home, as he passed by Pierre, would draw his head down, carelessly offer him his shaven, wrinkled cheek to kiss, and say, "Till tomorrow," or "We'll meet at dinner, or else I shall not see you," or "I stay at home for your sake," or the like. But notwithstanding the fact that Prince Vasili, according to his own account, stayed at home for Pierre's sake, he did not exchange 2 words with him, and yet Pierre did not feel himself strong enough to disappoint him. Each day he said to himself ever the same thing: "I must in the end understand her and explain her. What is she? Was I mistaken in her before, or am I mistaken now? No, she is not stupid. No, she is a beautiful girl," he said to himself from time to time. Never did she make a single error. Never, by any chance, did she say anything stupid. She spoke little, but what she said was always simple and clear. So she could not be stupid. Never was she agitated or confused. She could not be a vile woman. Often it chanced that he began to discuss with her, or to utter his thoughts in her hearing, but every time she replied in some brief but appropriately worded remark, showing that she was not interested, or else with a silent smile and look, which more palpably than anything else proved to Pierre her superiority. She was in the right, for she made it evident that all arguments and reasonings were rubbish in comparison with this smile. She always treated him with a radiant, confiding, and confidential smile, which was meant for himself alone, as though there were in it something more significant than there was in that smile which she wore for the world in general. Pierre knew that all were waiting for him to at last speak the one word needful, to step over the certain line, and he knew that sooner or later he should cross it. A strange and invincible horror seized him at the mere thought of this momentous step. 1,000 times in the course of this fortnight, during which he felt himself all the time drawn deeper and deeper into the terrible gulf, he said to himself, "What does it mean? What I need is decision. Why do I lack it?" He was anxious to come to a decision, but felt with horror that, in this matter, he was not displaying the strength of will which he knew he had, and which he really had. Pierre belonged to the number of those who are strong only when they have the consciousness of being perfectly pure. But ever since he had begun to be overmastered by the feeling of sensual desire that came upon him at Anna Pavlovna's, during the scene with the snuff-box, an undefined sense of guilt had paralyzed his will-power. On the evening of Ellen's name-day, a small party of friends and relatives, "our nearest and dearest," as the princess expressed it, took supper at Prince Vasili's. All these friends and relatives were given to understand that on this day the young lady's fate was to be decided. The guests were seated in the dining-room. The Princess Kuragina, the portly, imposing woman who had once been famous for her beauty, sat at the head of the table. On each side of her were placed the more important guests, an old general, his wife, and Anna Pavlovna Scherer, and at the other end of the table were the younger and less honored guests, and there, also, sat the various members of the household, Pierre and Ellen side by side. Prince Vasili did not sit down with the rest. He walked around the table, in a jocund mood, stopping to chat now with one, now with another of his guests, speaking some light and pleasant word to all, except Pierre and Ellen, whose presence he seemed entirely to ignore. Prince Vasili was the very life of the company. The wax candles burned brightly, the silver and cut glass gleamed, the jewels of the ladies and the gold and silver epaulets of the officers glistened. The clatter of knives and plates and glasses and the hum of lively conversation was heard around the table. An aged chamberlain at one end was heard assuring an aged baroness of his passionate love for her, while her laugh in reply rang out. At the other end someone was telling of the misfortune that had fallen a certain Marya Viktorovna. Near the center of the table Prince Vasili was standing with a little circle of auditors, while he told the ladies, with a facetious smile on his face, of the last meeting on Wednesday of the Imperial Council, at which Sergei Kuzmich-Vazmitinoff, the new military governor-general of Petersburg, received and read the then famous receipt addressed to him from the army headquarters by the Emperor Alexander Pavlovich. The Emperor declared that he was receiving from all sides proofs of the devotion of the people, and that the demonstration of Petersburg was particularly delightful to him, that he was proud of being the head of such a nation, and would do all in his power to prove himself worthy of the honor. This rescript began with the words, "Sergei Kuzmich, from all sides reports reach me." "And so he could not get further than Sergei Kuzmich?" asked a lady. "No, not a hair's breadth," replied Prince Vasili, laughing. "Sergei Kuzmich, from all sides. Sergei Kuzmich, from all sides." Poor Vazmitinoff could not get any further. Several times he began the letter over again, but could only say Sergei, then sobs, Kuzmitich, tears, and then the words "from all sides" were drowned in sobs, and he could not get any further. And again his handkerchief, and again Sergei Kuzmich, from all sides, and more tears, until at last he had to get someone else to read it for him. "Kuzmich, from all sides," and tears, repeated someone with a laugh. "Don't be naughty," exclaimed Anna Pavlovna from the other end of the table, raising her finger threateningly. "Our good Vyazmitinoff is such a dear, excellent man." This greatly amused the company. At the upper end of the table, where sat the honorary guests, all were apparently in jovial spirits, and under the influence of the most varied and lively emotions, but Pierre and Ellen sat silent, side by side, at the lower end of the table. On the faces of each hovered a radiant smile, not evoked by the story about Sergei Kuzmitich, but rather a smile of bashfulness at their own thoughts. The others might chatter and laugh and jest. They might with good appetite enjoy the Rhine wine and the sauté and the ice creams. They might let their eyes avoid resting on that couple. They might seem to be quite indifferent and even to ignore their existence. Nevertheless, there was something in the very atmosphere that made it evident by the furtive glances bent upon them that the anecdote about Sergei Kuzmitich and the laugh that it evoked, and the dinner and everything were but merely pretense, and that the energies of the whole company were, in reality, devoted to this young couple, Pierre and Ellen, even while Prince Vasili was imitating the lachrymose Sergei Kuzmitich. All the time his glance sought his daughter, and even when he was laughing his heartiest, The expression on his face seemed to say, "Yes, yes, it is going all right. It will be decided this evening." Anna Pavlovna, when she threatened him with Notre Dame Vasmatinov, let Prince Vasili read in her eyes as they flashed for a moment in Pierre's direction a congratulation for his daughter's coming marriage and good fortune. The old princess, as she offered a glass of wine to her neighbor with a melancholy sigh, and glanced gravely toward her daughter, seemed to say by this sigh, "Yes, my dear, now there is nothing for us but to sip sweet wine. Now it is the young people's turn to be insolently, defiantly happy. And what melancholy rubbish all that I have to say is, as though it meant anything," thought the old diplomat, as he gazed at the happy faces of the lovers. "Yonder is true happiness." Amid these mean, petty, and artificial interests uniting this company, there arose the natural feeling of attraction felt for each other by a handsome and healthful young man and woman, and this human feeling put to naught and soared above all their artificial babble. The jests were not amusing, the news was not interesting, the liveliness was only counterfeited. Not only they, but also the servants, waiting on the table, seemed to feel the same thing, and forget the proprieties of the service, as they gazed on beautiful Ellen, with her radiant face, and on Pierre's comely, stout face, so happy and so uneasy. It even seemed as if the light from the candles were all concentrated on these two happy faces. Pierre was conscious that he was the center of everything, and this position both pleased him and made him uncomfortable. He found himself in the position of a man plunged in some sort of absorbing occupation. He saw nothing, heard nothing, understood nothing clearly. Only occasionally through his consciousness flashed fragmentary thoughts and expressions of the reality. "And so it is all over," he said to himself. "How in the world did it happen? It was so sudden. Now I know that it is not for her sake alone, nor for my sake alone, but for the sake of all. This must be accomplished without fail. They all expect this so confidently. They are so certain that it will take place that I cannot disappoint them. But how will it take place? I know not, but it will be. It infallibly must be," thought Pierre, as he glanced at those shoulders gleaming so near him. Then suddenly a feeling of humiliation mingled in his thoughts. He felt embarrassed to be the object of general attention, to be a lucky man in the eyes of all others, to be another, though homely Paris, possessing his Helen of Troy. "But, to be sure, this has always been, and therefore it must be so," he said, trying to comfort himself. "And besides, what have I done to bring it about? When did it begin? I came from Moscow with Prince Vasili. There was certainly nothing in that. Then what harm was there in my staying at his house? And so I played cards with her, and picked up her reticule, and went to drive with her. When did it begin? When did it all begin? And now here he is sitting by her, in the quality of accepted suitor, hearing, seeing, feeling her presence, her breathing, her every motion, her beauty." Then suddenly it seemed to him that it was not she who was the beauty, but he himself, and to such an extraordinary degree that all had to look at him, and that he, delighting in this universal admiration, swelled out his chest, raised his head high, and rejoiced in his own happiness. Suddenly he heard a voice, a well-known voice, speaking and saying something for the second time, but Pierre was so absorbed that he did not comprehend what was said to him. "I asked you when you last heard from Bolkonsky," said Prince Vasili for the third time. "How absent-minded you are, my dear fellow." Prince Vasili smiled, and Pierre saw that all were smiling at him and at Ellen. "Well, suppose you all do know," said Pierre to himself. "What then? It is true." And he himself smiled his sweet, childlike smile, and Ellen also smiled. "When did you get the letter? Was it from Olmutz?" repeated Prince Vasili, who pretended that he wished to know in order to decide a dispute. "How can one talk and think about such trifles?" was Pierre's mental exclamation. "Yes, from Olmutz," he replied with a sigh. After supper Pierre gave his arm to Ellen and led her to the drawing-room in the wake of the others. The guests began to disperse, and some went away without bidding Ellen farewell. Others, as though unwilling to tear her away from serious concerns, went up to her for a minute and then hurried away, without allowing her to accompany them to the door. The diplomat preserved a mournful silence as he left the drawing-room. The utter futility of his diplomatic career presented itself in comparison with Pierre's good fortune. The old general growled out a surly reply to his wife when she asked him about the gout in his foot. "Eka, the old fool," he said to himself. "Here's Elena Vasilievna, and she'll be just as much of a beauty at 50. "It seems as though I might congratulate you," said Anna Pavlovna in a whisper to the old princess, and gave her a resounding kiss. "If I hadn't a sick headache I would stay a little longer." The princess made no answer. She was tormented by jealousy at her daughter's good fortune. While the guests were taking their departure, Pierre was left for some time alone with Ellen in the little sitting-room where they often sat. During the past fortnight he had been often alone with Ellen, but he had never said a word to her about love. Now he felt that this was indispensable, but still he found it impossible to make up his mind to undertake this last step. He felt abashed. It seemed that here in Ellen's presence he occupied a place that belonged to someone else. "Not for thee is this good fortune," some internal voice seemed to whisper. "This happiness is for those who have not what thou hast." But it was essential to say something, and he tried to talk. He asked her if she had enjoyed the evening. She replied with her usual simplicity that this name-day had been one of the pleasant events of her life. One or two of the nearest relatives still remained. They were gathered in the great drawing-room. Prince Vasili with leisurely steps came to Pierre. Pierre got up and remarked that it was already late. Prince Vasili looked at him with a gravely questioning face, as much as to imply that what he said was too strange to be heard. But instantly this expression of sternness vanished, and Prince Vasili laid his hand on Pierre's sleeve, making him sit down again, and gave him a flattering smile. "Well, Leolia?" he asked, turning instantly to his daughter, with that easy-going tone of habitual affection peculiar to parents who have lived on terms of especial affection with their children ever since their childhood, but which in Prince Vasili's case had been acquired only through having observed other parents. And then he turned again to Pierre. "Sergei Kuzmitich, from all sides," he repeated, nervously unbuttoning the upper button of his waistcoat. Pierre smiled, but his smile made it evident how well he understood that Prince Vasili was not interested now in this anecdote about Sergei Kuzmitich, and Prince Vasili understood that Pierre understood this. Prince Vasili suddenly muttered some excuse and left the room. It seemed to Pierre that even Prince Vasili was embarrassed. The appearance of embarrassment in this old society man deeply affected Pierre. He glanced at Ellen, and she, it seemed, was also embarrassed, and her glance said, "Well, it is all your fault." "It is absolutely indispensable for me to take this step, but I cannot, said Pierre to himself, and once more he began to talk about irrelevant things, about Sergei Kuzmitich, asking what was the point of this anecdote, as he had not caught it. Ellen, with a smile, confessed that she also knew nothing about it. When Prince Vasili returned to the drawing-room, the princess was engaged in talking in low tones with an elderly lady about Pierre. "Of course it is a brilliant match, but happiness, my dear," said she in the usual mixture of French and Russian. "Marriages are made in heaven." "Les mariages se font dans les yeux," returned the old lady. Prince Vasili, pretending not to hear what she said, went to the farthest table and sat down on the sofa. He closed his eyes and appeared to be dozing. His head sank forward, and then he woke with a start. "Alina," he said to his wife, "go and see what they are doing." The princess went to the door, passed by it with a significant but indifferent look, and glanced in. Pierre and Ellen were still sitting and talking. "Just the same," she said in reply to her husband. Prince Vasili scowled and screwed his mouth to one side, and his cheeks began to twitch with that unpleasant coarse expression so characteristic of him. Then with a sudden impulse he sprang to his feet, threw his head back, and with decided steps strode past the ladies into the little sitting-room. Swiftly and with great assumption of delight, he went straight to Pierre. His face was so unusually triumphant that Pierre, in seeing him, rose to his feet in dismay. Slava Bohu! Glory to God! He cried. My wife has told me all. He threw one arm around Pierre, the other around his daughter. My dear boy, Leola, I am very, very glad. His voice trembled. I loved your father, and she will make you a good wife. God bless you. He embraced his daughter, then Pierre again, and kissed him with his malodorous mouth. Tears actually moistened his cheeks. Princess, come here, he cried. The princess came and wept. The elderly lady also wiped her eyes with her handkerchief. They kissed Pierre, and he kissed the lovely Ellen's hand several times. After a little while they were left alone again. All this had to be so, and could not be otherwise, thought Pierre, and there is no need to ask if it be good or evil. Good at least in that it is decided, and I am no longer tortured by suspense. Pierre silently held the hand of his betrothed and looked at her fair bosom as it rose and fell. Ellen, he said aloud, and then paused. He was aware that something of this sort must be said under such circumstances, but he could not for the life of him remember what was the proper thing to say. He looked into her face. She came nearer to him. Her face grew crimson. Ach, take them off. How they... She pointed to his glasses. Pierre took them off, and his eyes had a scared and entreating look in addition to that strange expression which people's eyes assume when they remove their glasses suddenly. He was about to bend over her hand and kiss it, but she with a quick and abrupt motion of her head intercepted the motion and pressed her lips to his. Her face disturbed Pierre by its changed and unpleasantly passionate expression. Now it is too late. It is all decided. Yes, and I love her, thought Pierre. Je vous aime, he said at last, remembering what was necessary in these circumstances, but these words sounded so meagre that he was ashamed of himself. At the end of a fortnight he was married, the fortunate possessor, as they say, of a beautiful wife and of millions, and settled in the enormous Petersburg mansion of the Counts Bezukhoi, newly refitted for them. End of chapter 2.